In the previous discussions, we have seen the development of the nervous system. We have seen the divisions of the nervous system into central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system, but also seen the cells of the nervous system in both central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. And today, let's talk about the cerebrum, the biggest part of the brain. What's up, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome back to NeuroSketch with Dr. Ken. But if this is the first time you've seen this channel, don't forget to subscribe. Today we're going to talk about the cerebrum, the biggest part of the brain. And to begin with, let's see the outline. So we're going to have a short revision on the major parts of the brain, but our point of focus today is the cerebrum. So we're going to talk about the surface anatomy of the cerebrum. We're going to talk about the lobes of the cerebral hemisphere. We talk about cerebral white matter, Brodmann areas, and sensory and motor areas of the brain. But I'm afraid we will not be able to cover all of this in a single video, so I'll be sure to check the next video really soon, because it's a continuation of this one. Okay, so and as part of clinical correlates, we're going to see the cerebral palsy, we're going to see the cerebral dominance and aphasia. Now the major parts of the brain. We said you have midbrain, pons, and medulla. Together they are forming a continuous stalk, and this stalk is called the brainstem. And just behind the brainstem, we have the cerebellum, which is translated to the little brain in Latin. On top of the brainstem, we have the diencephalon, and sitting on top of the diencephalon is the biggest part of the brain, which is called cerebrum. And actually, the word cerebrum is the Latin word for brain. So it literally means brain. Okay, so let's see the orientation of the major parts of the brain. Okay, we have two systems of orientations. We have orientation above the brainstem, and we have orientation from brainstem downsides. And this orientation is very important, because if you want to describe different relationship between two different parts of the brain, then you need to understand this orientation for you to be able to say. For example, when you want to say something is proximal to, or something is ventral, on the ventral surface of, or something, you need to understand this orientation. Okay, so above the brainstem, we are using orientation same as the orientation of reptiles. You know, the class Reptilia. And in class Reptilia, this is the rostral part, or the rostroproximal part, and this is the caudal part, and then this surface here is the dorsal surface, and here is the ventral surface. Same applies. Above the brainstem, you are using this orientation in such a way that this is the rostral part of this cerebrum, the rostral part, and this is the caudal part of the cerebrum, and this here is the dorsal part of the cerebrum, and inside here we have the ventral part of the cerebrum. This is very, very important. Above the brainstem, orientation is same as reptiles. But when you are moving to the brainstem, you see, now if you pay much attention, you understand that the brainstem is almost perpendicular to the cerebrum. I mean, when you're moving from the cerebrum to the brainstem, you have to rotate like 90 degrees in clockwise direction. And so the orientation is also rotating 90 degrees in clockwise direction in such a way that this part over here will be the rostral part, and this part here is the caudal. This surface is the ventral surface, and this is the dorsal surface. For example, when you want to discuss the relationship between the midbrain and the pons, you will say the midbrain is rostral to pons, and the pons is rostral to the medulla, but the medulla is caudal to the pons, and the pons is caudal to the midbrain. Same applies, you will say the cerebellum is on the dorsal surface of the pons or brainstem, and the brainstem is on the ventral side of the ventral surface of the cerebellum. I mean, this is very important, and this orientation will be using it every now and then. Now let's go to our point of discussion today, which is the cerebrum. And the cerebrum is the seat of intelligence. I mean, you see one intelligent person today because of the cerebrum. If you take out the cerebrum, mean you are not going to be intelligent anyhow. And in fact, when someone tells you to use your brain, they are literally telling you to use your cerebrum, because this is what makes you make sense. You make sense to people just because of presence of cerebrum, because this is the one that gives you ability to read and write, speak, make calculation, compose music, plan for the future, remember the past, be able to imagine of things that have never existed before. And you know, in fact, this is one that makes you look a responsible adult today just because of the presence of the cerebrum. And if you remember, the cerebrum is is a part of this forebrain, and is coming from the telencephalon, which is coming from the prosencephalon. And by far, the major part of the cerebrum is composed of the two cerebral hemispheres, left and right hemisphere. Hemi means half, so hemisphere will have left hemisphere and the right cerebral hemisphere. but it was also part of it is also composed by this nuclei, deep nuclei, which are called the basal ganglia. We're going to discuss about them in little more details. Okay, so let's see the structure of the cerebrum. The cerebrum has got two layers: outer layer, which is the layer of gray matter, and the inner layer, which is the layer of white matter. And the gray matter, because it's outside, it's also known as cortex. So the word cerebral cortex is an alternative name for gray matter of the brain, and this is white matter. And surprisingly enough, we have gray matter deep within white matter. Oh wow. So we expect to have two layers: the outer layer of gray matter, the inner layer of white matter. But surprisingly, we have gray matter deep within white matter. We call them nuclei. Okay. Okay, so this region here appears white because it's a correction of myelin-related axons with myelin sheath. Because myelin sheath is what makes this region white. Okay, so white matter area, collection of myelin-related axons. What is the function of axons? They are propagating action potential from cell bodies, right? So they are conducting action potential, and this is to say the white matter areas of both the brain and the spinal cord, they are just conducting parts. So they are like conducting wires. And on the other hand, this region here appears gray because of correction of neuronal cell bodies. Neuronal cell bodies together with the unmyelinated axons are the one that are making this region looking gray. And let me ask you a simple question. Between a cell body and the axon, which one is functional? Cell body, right? Yes, the cell body is the functional one because it has got a nucleus. And remember, all the function of the cell are being done by a nucleus. And this is to say, all the function of the brain are being done by the gray matter, because the gray matter is the one that has got neuronal cell bodies, and the neuronal cell bodies have got nuclei, and these are the functional area of the brain. But both gray matter on the cortex and the gray matter deep within white matter, these are the functional area of the brain. And the white matter, they are just connecting wires. These are connecting different parts of the brain into one another to make sure that the brain is working in synchronicity. Of course, this deep gray matter, they are also called nuclei because the word nuclei is a correction of neuronal cell bodies within the central nervous system, both in the brain and the spinal cord. And mind you, both the brain and the spinal cord have got white and gray matter, but the difference is in the spinal cord, the white matter is outside and the gray matter is inside. But in the brain, the gray matter is outside and the white matter is inside. So we have this little bit difference between the brain and spinal cord. And I've told you all the cerebral function are being done by the gray matter, which is the cerebral cortex, and also being helped by the deep gray matter that are called the nuclei. The gray matter is usually only 2 to 4 millimeter thick, but it has got a number of layers, like 6 different layers that are helping it to do different function, that help it to perform different function. One more time, we've said the brain has got two main layers: the outer layer, which is the layer of gray matter, and the inner layer, which is the layer of white matter. Now, during embryological development, the gray matter grows at a higher rate compared to the white matter, and the result is the gray matter becomes huge compared to the white matter. So what happens? For it to be able to be accommodated within a small skull of the baby, then it has to undergo convolutions. It has to folds upon itself, and because the outer layer is bigger than the inner layer, these convolutions, these foldings, they are increasing surface area of the cerebral cortex. And remember, I've told you the cerebral cortex or gray matter is the one that is doing the functions of the brain. The cerebral function are being done by the gray matter. So when it's folding upon itself, it's increasing the surface area for different activities of the brain. Now, these convolutions, these foldings, it creates elevations and depressions. And the elevations are called gyrus if it's singular, but if a plural, called the gyri or convolutions, but you're using the word gyri for plural. For singular is gyrus. And the depressions are called the sulcus or sulcus, and in plural they are called sulci or sulci. Okay, or sulci or sulci. And the deep grooves are called fissure. For example, this one is called a fissure. Now we have a gyrus, sulcus, but this sulcus, because it's deep enough, it becomes a fissure. So a fissure is just a deep sulcus. Okay. And we have a picture here which is showing we have gyrus, sulcus, gyrus, sulcus, gyrus. Almost every gyrus is followed by sulcus. Yeah, almost every gyrus is followed by a sulcus, and this here is a fissure because this is deep sulcus. It's a deep groove called the sulcus, and the prominent fissure is called the longitudinal fissure. The biggest or the deepest fissure is called the longitudinal fissure. This is the most prominent fissure, and this one is remarkable because this is the one that separates the two cerebral hemisphere. Remember, we have said we have two hemispheres and the basal ganglia that are forming the part of the cerebrum, and these are the hemispheres. This is the left hemisphere, this is the right hemisphere, and then these here are the basal nuclei. We're going to discuss them in later discussions. And this is the left hemisphere, this is the right hemisphere, and they are being separated by a deep groove which is called the longitudinal fissure. It is longitudinal because it's going on the longitudinal axis of the body. But if you guys remember, we said the two cerebral hemispheres are being separated by falx cerebri. When we were doing anatomy of the cranial cavity, we said the supratentorial compartment is being divided by falx cerebri into left and right compartment, and this compartment are being occupied by respective cerebral hemisphere. Like the left compartment is being occupied by the left cerebral hemisphere, and the right compartment is being occupied by the right cerebral hemisphere. Now this falx cerebri is going through the longitudinal fissure here. Okay, so the falx cerebri is going through the longitudinal fissure to partially compartmentalize the left cerebral hemisphere and the right cerebral hemisphere. But these two hemispheres, they remain connected by the so-called corpus callosum to make sure that brain is working under synchronicity, like the left side and the right side have been communicating with one another. Okay, so we have separation, which is a physical separation by the falx cerebri, which is going through the longitudinal fissure, but this cerebral hemisphere, they remain connected to one another by the way of the corpus callosum. And the word corpus callosum translates to the hard body, because corpus means body and the callosum means hard. So this is the hard body, and of course it's a white matter, as you can see. What is the function of white matter? I've just told you they are connecting wires. Yeah. So this means that the corpus callosum is communicating the left cerebral hemisphere and the right cerebral hemisphere. Of course, it sits at the base, at the floor of the longitudinal fissure. Okay, let's now talk about the main parts, the main lobes of the cerebral hemisphere. So these are the primary lobes of the cerebral hemisphere. The cerebral hemisphere has got 4 primary lobes, and these lobes have been named depending on the bones that are covered in them. For example, this is called the frontal lobe because it's been covered by the frontal bone. This is parietal lobe because it's been covered by parietal bone. This is temporal because it's been covered by temporal bone. Same applies to the occipital lobe. Is occipital lobe because it's been covered by occipital bone. What are the primary function of these lobes? What are the primary function of these lobes? These are the primary functions of these lobes. Of course, they have a lot of function. They have a lot of interaction. But if you ask it to name only one function per each lobe, this is what you should mention. For example, the frontal lobe is known for cognitive function. And by definition, cognitive function, these are those functions that make you make sense. For example, reasoning, problem solving, planning for the future, judgment, and all other functions that fall in under cognitive function. And all these have been done by the frontal lobe. And it doesn't mean that the frontal lobe has got no any other function. No, it does got cognitive function, but also it does some other function in interaction with other lobes. Same applies to the temporal lobe. The primary function of the temporal lobe is the auditory processing of the auditory information. Of course, it has got also other functions, but this is the primary function. The parietal lobe is known for somatic sensation from the body, and also is also known for spatial orientation. I'm going to explain a little bit later what spatial orientation is, but if you ask it to name only one function of parietal lobe, you can include you can take the somatic sensation. Occipital lobe is easy because the occipital lobe is dealing with the vision, and in other words, the occipital lobe is also known as the visual cortex because it's dealing with the visual information. In little much details, these are the function of these different lobes. The frontal lobe, we've said, is dealing with the eye cognitive function. And these are reasoning, problem solving, decision making, planning, judgment, personality. Okay, but it also controls other functions like motor. So it also does motor control, speech control. It has got a Broca's area. We're going to discuss what a Broca's area is, and also it has got some aspect of language comprehension. But the temporal lobe is dealing with auditory information, understanding the sound that you are listening. Yeah, so it processes the auditory information, and this is the primary function. But it also, you know, it also helps in language comprehension, understanding the written and the spoken language. All these have been done by the temporal lobe. This is to say, if you have damage to the temporal lobe, you might not be able to read and write. Yeah. Okay, so or to interpret what is being written or something. We're going to discuss them in much details as we're moving. But also, we have said it does not only do the auditory processing, it also does the memory. It's taking part of the limbic system through hippocampus, and the hippocampus is helping in memory formation, but also visual processing. Remember, I've just told you that the visual information is being processed by the occipital lobe, and this is the primary function of the occipital lobe. But the temporal lobe is also helping in some ways. You're going to see later the visual pathway, and you understand what I mean when I say it also takes part in visual information. Parietal lobe, we have said, is dealing with the somatic sensation, somatic sensation. And by definition, what are the somatic sensation? So these are sense of temperature, touch, pressure, pain, vibration, and joint position, proprioception. These are somatic sensation, and these are called somatic sensation to differentiate them from spatial sensation. What are the spatial sensation? Well, 5 spatial sensation, and these are the sense of vision, sense of smell, sense of taste. Remember when you said the anterior two-third is receiving the spatial sensation from the chorda tympani. That spatial sensation is the sense of taste, and the taste is one among the spatial sensation. One more time, the sense of vision, the sense of smell, the sense of taste, the sense of auditory information, and also the sense of balance by the cranial nerve number 8. All these are the spatial sensation, and they are not included in parietal, in somatosensory, somatic sensation. Are we together? The somatic sensation, by definition, these are pain, temperature, pressure, touch, itch, vibration, and the joint, the sense of joint positioning, which is called the proprioception. So the parietal lobe is for somatic sensation and the spatial manipulation. And the spatial manipulation is also known as the spatial orientation. And this is your ability to understand and keep track of your body positioning and the objects around you. In simple terms, this is how you know where you are, where the things are, and how to move between them. I'm giving you an example. When you wake up in your room in the middle of the night, the power is off, you want to go to washroom, and you cannot see, so you assume, okay, I know somewhere here there should be a table, and somewhere here there should be a chair, and maybe the door is somewhere. When I'm walking maybe 2-3 steps, I will find the door. So this is called the spatial orientation or the spatial manipulation. But the spatial manipulation will also help you to navigate through spaces. For example, spatial manipulation is also very important when you are receiving instruction about places. For example, let me give you an example. Assume we're in Mwanza right now, and maybe you're coming from Dar es Salaam, and now I'm giving you instruction about a place in Dar es Salaam. For example, I am telling you, when you are coming from Mwimbili National Hospital on your way to the fire bus stop, before you reach the fire stop, there is usually on the right side there's usually a gate for a school which is called Tambaza Secondary School, for example. And before you reach the school, on the left side there's usually a small mini market right over there. You know that market? Okay, I know. Okay, that ability, you are not in Dar es Salaam, remember, but that ability of you assuming you are in Dar es Salaam and actually understanding what I'm saying, that is also called the spatial manipulation. It's very, very important, and you can always thank your parietal lobe for helping you to navigate in spaces. You're putting your body in a space. And also, when you want to go to the washroom in the middle of the night, the power is off, you cannot see anything, it's totally dark, you're just going by faith. You can always thank your parietal lobe. But also the parietal lobe, this is spatial manipulation, is also very important for reading maps. Yeah, when you're going somewhere, for example, soldiers back in time, they used, like, there were no cell phones, and they're using only, they are relying on papers. Yeah, so for them being able to to locate themselves in spaces, they could only rely on the parietal lobe. Next, we have the occipital lobe. As we've said, the occipital lobe is primarily known for visual processing, yeah, interpreting and the making sense of the visual information. When you have damage of the visual cortex, you might be able to see, but you're not understanding what you're seeing, and that's a different discussion. We have a separate discussion on the visual pathway. We are going to talk about it. Okay. We have said we have the four primary lobes of the brain, and then we have the fifth lobe of the brain, which is actually not seen from the surfaces. Is usually buried within the parietal and the frontal and temporal lobe here, and it's deep within the lateral sulcus, also called the sulcus of Cerebrum. We're going to discuss about it. This lobe over here is considered as the fifth lobe, and it's called the insula. And the insula is important for gustatory information, the sense of taste. Remember, I have told you the parietal lobe is dealing with the somatic sensation. It does not deal with spatial sensation. Now, the sense of taste being spatial is not carried out, is not processed by the parietal lobe, but it's been processed by the insular lobe, the fifth lobe. Okay, so it deals with gustatory information, the sensory motor processing, and autonomics, the autonomic system. Also have the sixth lobe. You can consider it the sixth lobe, but it's also called the limbic lobe, which is also called the limbic system. This is also a different discussion, and the limbic system is the one that is dealing with emotions, memory, rewards, and the punishment system. All these are being done by the limbic system, and this limbic system is a little bit like a functional lobe of the brain. It's like a functional lobe because it includes a lot of different structures from different parts, a part of the frontal lobe, a part of parietal lobe, a part of the temporal lobe, and they're also been contributing to the so-called the limbic system, and we'll have a different discussion at some point. Let's see some of the famous sulci. The sulcus number one is this one, which is called the central sulcus, also known as the sulcus of Rolando or Rolandic fissure. All this name for this sulcus: central sulcus, sulcus of Rolando, Rolandic fissure. This one is the one that separates the frontal lobe from parietal lobe. It's between the frontal and the parietal lobe. The fissure number two is called the lateral sulcus. This is the central sulcus because of the center. This is the lateral sulcus because of the lateral surface, yeah? And it's called the lateral sulcus, also known as the sulcus of Cerebrum or the Cerebral fissure. All these for the same Cerebral fissure here. Okay, so this one separates the temporal lobe from frontal and parietal lobe. It separates the temporal lobe from frontal and parietal lobe, and it's called the lateral sulcus or the Cerebral fissure or the lateral sulcus of Cerebrum. Next, we have the parietal occipital lobe, and from the name parietal occipital, this one it separates the occipital lobe from the parietal lobe, but it's usually seen on the medial surface and not on the lateral surface. So on the medial surface, this is the parietal occipital lobe. It separates the parietal lobe from the occipital lobe, or the other way around. And of course, we're going to see later that also on the occipital lobe, we also have a fissure here, which is called the calcaline fissure. We're going to see it a little bit later. Calcaline fissure, which is separating two parts of the occipital lobe. Now let's talk about the famous gyri. But before we continue, take a look at the central sulcus. Yeah, this is the central sulcus, the sulcus of Rolando, Rolandic fissure. And I've told you, every sulcus is formed by a gyri. Sulcus gyrus. So the central sulcus is sitting between two major gyri. The gyrus before you reach the central sulcus, and the gyrus after you leave the central sulcus. So if you're coming from anterior side, you're going to meet the pre-central gyrus, the gyrus before going to the central sulcus, and also you are going after moving from the central sulcus, you're going to see the post-central gyrus, the gyrus after the central sulcus. Now, by definition, the pre-central gyrus is the primary motor area. The primary motor area, which is also called the Brodmann area number 4. You can always write that down. It's the area number 4, which is also called the pre-central gyrus. But the post-central gyrus is the primary somatosensory area, and you are not surprised because the somatosensory is the function of the parietal lobe, right? And the motor is the function of the frontal lobe. You are not surprised. The precentral gyrus on the frontal lobe, primary motor area, which is the Brodmann area number 4, but the post-central gyrus is the primary somatosensory area, of course sitting the parietal lobe, and is a Brodmann area 3, 1 and 2, and not 1, 2, 3. We're going to explain them a little bit later, but also have we're going to see some of these major gyri on the temporal lobe. This is superior temporal gyrus, the middle temporal gyrus, and the inferior temporal gyrus. This superior one is important for auditory processing, the language comprehension. We've just spoken about how the temporal lobe is important in auditory processing, and that is, we're going to discuss about it a little bit later. So this is the inferior view. I mean, at this moment I don't think we'll have a lot of things to discuss at this one, but we will always come back to this image. The medial surface of the cerebral hemisphere, this is how it looks like. Of course, we have this corpus callosum. We're going to talk about the corpus callosum as one among the white matter areas of the brain, but these are the regions, these are the parts of the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum has got the rostrum. The rostrum has got the genu, which means knee. In case you're wondering, cingrum in that belt that the Roman Catholic priest used to put when they're going, like, it's a belt like something. You can Google it, like cingrum, which is written like this one. This is cingulate gyrus, but it's also written cingrum, which is a belt. You can Google and see how it looks like. I forgot to put a picture over here. Okay, so this one is the cingulate gyrus, yeah, and the cingulate gyrus is usually followed by a cingulate sulcus. So this one over here is the cingulate sulcus. Let me show you here. This is a cingulate sulcus going all the way here. This is not the central sulcus. Let me remind you one more time. The central sulcus is not well seen on the medial surface. It is well established on the lateral surface, but on the medial side, it is not seen. Of course, this is your central sulcus here. But this one here, this is the cingulate sulcus, and not the central sulcus does not go through the medial side, yeah, but the cingulate does. Yeah, but the cingulate also does not go to the lateral side, and the central sulcus goes to the lateral side. And of course, this is the central sulcus, as I've just told you, and we've already seen this is the parietal occipital sulcus, which is separating the parietal lobe from the occipital lobe, and this is the occipital lobe, and I've told you occipital lobe also been divided by a fissure which is called the calcaline fissure, and the most posterior part of the occipital lobe is called the occipital. It's called a lingula or occipital pole lingula. Again, each lobe is further subdivided into gyri by sulci. Okay, and then it's further divided into gyri, temporal sulcus, and this is the temporal sulcus, but these two, they are dividing the temporal lobe into the superior temporal gyrus, middle temporal gyrus, and the inferior temporal gyrus. Same applies. The frontal lobe is also further subdivided by sulci into gyri. For example, you have the superior frontal gyrus, which is gyrus frontalis superior, which is that is Latin, and also we have gyrus frontalis medius, which is the medial frontal gyrus, and this is the inferior frontal gyrus, which is also called the gyrus frontalis inferior. Okay, we have the gyrus precentralis, which is the precentral gyrus, primary motor area, the Brodmann area number 4, which is found on the frontal lobe, but also have the gyrus postcentralis, which is the post-central gyrus, which is the Brodmann area number 3, 1 and 2, is the primary somatosensory area, and is found on the temple, on the parietal lobe. And of course you have also the so these are the major gyri, and these are the major sulci that are dividing these different parts, different lobes of the cerebral hemisphere into small gyri. Okay, so we have something which is called the cerebral lateralization, and so we have a very important concept which is called the cerebral lateralization, which is the general principle that certain functions are preferentially processed by one hemisphere more than the other hemisphere. They are preferentially processed by one hemisphere more than other hemisphere. For example, take example of language. For example, if language is more processed by the left hemisphere than the right hemisphere, then this whole process is known as the cerebral lateralization, and this brings about a very important concept which is called the cerebral dominance. And actually it means that hemisphere which is processing one information more than the other hemisphere is called the dominant hemisphere. For example, if the language was preferentially processed by the left hemisphere, then the left hemisphere is dominant over the right hemisphere in terms of language, because it dominates that language, it dominates that function, and this is what the cerebral dominance is. So the cerebral dominance is like a subset of the cerebral lateralization. The cerebral dominance is also known as the hemispheric dominance, which is the functional brain asymmetry of a brain in terms of functionality and not anatomy, because the anatomy of the two cerebral hemispheres is almost the same. They have no difference, almost the same. But what differs in cerebral dominance is the functional asymmetry. Like the certain function is preferentially performed by or processed by the left hemisphere, and the certain is preferentially performed by the right hemisphere. And I tell you what, in majority of population, maybe 97% of population, the dominant hemisphere is the left hemisphere. The left hemisphere is the dominant hemisphere in majority of population. You and I are going to explain a little bit later. Okay, so the idea that one hemisphere, usually the left hemisphere, plays a dominant role in controlling all complex and cognitive process is called the hemispheric dominance, or the cerebral dominance. Okay, so we are using these three functions to define the cerebral dominance, but especially the language. That means the hemisphere that is processing the speech and language more than the other hemisphere, that hemisphere will be considered as the dominant hemisphere. And as I've told you, in most of people in the population, the left hemisphere is processing the speech and the perception of language, and so the left hemisphere is dominant in majority of population. And this is why most of people, they are right-handed. Most of people like you and I are right-handed. That means our dominant hemisphere is the left, because we're going to mention later that the left side of the brain controls the right side of the body, and the right side of the brain controls the left side of the body. We're going to discuss it a little bit later, but in terms of cerebral dominance, if you are right-handed, most likely your dominant hemisphere is the left cerebral hemisphere, and so the speech and the language perception are being done on the on your left hemisphere. But you also have some other functions which are being performed by the non-dominant hemisphere, in this case the right hemisphere, and these are the recognition of face and the music. All these have been interpreted by the non-dominant hemisphere, which is the right hemisphere to majority of individuals. So most of people who are left-handed means the right side of the brain is the dominant, the right cerebral hemisphere is the dominant over the left, and so most likely that the speech and the language perception, they are also being done by the right hemisphere, because all of these are being done by the dominant hemisphere. As I've said, so more than 90% of adult population, they are right-handed. That means the left cerebral hemisphere is dominant to them. And in about 96% of adult population, in the left hemisphere is the dominant for speech. Okay, left hemisphere is the dominant for speech. So the explanations for dominance, they are not clearly understood. Like why? Because I've said this is just a functional. This is the functional brain asymmetry. There is little to no anatomical differences between the two cerebral hemispheres, and this difference will not account for the cerebral dominance. What accounts for is a functional functional asymmetry. It's also very important to note that the two cerebral hemispheres usually have equal potential capabilities in a newborn, and the cerebral dominance is achieved at the age of 10. That means if you have a 5-year-old child with damage to the dominant hemisphere, he or she can learn to use to become the left-handed and can speak very well. Okay, but this is usually impossible, almost impossible in adults, because the cerebral dominance is already achieved. All right, folks, this is what I had for you today. If you have question, additional comment, you can always sing by. We have TikTok and Instagram account. You can always have a look. But be sure to watch the next part and see you.